Way, way back, when the earth was still flat, there was only one sea and only one land. And the sea was so vast that each night the moon would come and wash in its waters. And the land was ruled by a king. We're doing our king stories right now. And the king was much loved by his people, or at least that's what he thought. Each day he would practice the same routine. He would look in the mirror, make sure his hair was smart, step out onto the balcony, and the crowd would roar their approval. Each day the same ritual. But one day he noticed in the mirror before stepping out that there was a small bump on his head. So he very carefully combed his hair, hid the bump, stepped onto the balcony, and roar there in cyberspace. Now, the next day, the lump had grown even larger and he had to completely change his hairstyle. The third day, the lump was pushing against his crown. The fourth day, the crown was hanging off the top and he didn't dare go out. So he called the king's hatter and he said to the hatter, "Look, I seem to have grown this horn on my head. Can you do something for me?" And the hatter fashioned the most beautiful, large crown which completely hid the horn, made of gold and silk and velvet. And then the king thought, "Oh no, now the hatter knows my secret." So he called his trusty servant. "Thug!" "Yes, your majesty." "Thug, chop off the hatter's head." "Yes, your majesty." So out in the dark of the darkest night went Thug with his enormous great sabre and hi-ya! He chopped off the hatter's head as he slept in his bed. For a while all was well, but soon the king needed a haircut. So he called the king's hairdresser, and the king's hairdresser very carefully cut around the king's horn. "Thug!" "Yes, your majesty." "Chop off the hairdresser's head." "Yes, your majesty." So out in the dark of the darkest night went Thug with his enormous sabre, hi-ya! And that was the end of the hairdresser, dead in his bed. For a while all was well. But then a month passed and he needed another haircut. So he got out yellow pages, whatever. That's what they had in those days. And he looked at hairdressers. Yes, A, started at the beginning. Abel, the hairdresser, came. "Thug!" "Yes, your majesty." "Chop off Abel's hair." Hiya! B, Bernstein, it's a Jewish story, it really is. Bernstein came to cut the king's hair. "Thug!" "Yes, your majesty." Hiya! That was the end of Bernstein. Cohen, Dinglebaum, hairdresser after hairdresser after hairdresser after hairdresser until there was only one hairdresser left. Zimmerman. Now, Zimmerman, he knew something was wrong. How did he know? Well, is this about lockdown? Yeah, it could be. Zimmerman, all of you people who need haircuts, you should have gone to Zimmerman's. Now, Zimmerman knew something was wrong. His door. I mean, he was a terrible hairdresser. Hardly anyone came to him, but now suddenly there were thousands of people outside his door. He went into hiding because he was scared something was going wrong, but soon he could no longer afford to feed his family. And he presented himself as called for by the king. He came to court and the king said, "Zimmerman cut my hair." "Yes, your majesty." And so very carefully, Zimmerman cut the king's hair. Oh, that's a terrible haircut, Zimmerman. "Thug!" "Yes, your majesty." "Chop off Zimmerman." No, I can't chop off Zimmerman's head. If I chop off his head, there'll be no hairdressers left, not even a bad one. "Zimmerman," said the king, "you must promise me not to tell anybody what you've seen here." No, your majesty." What have I seen here? My horn, you idiot." "Oh, no, I won't tell anybody." "Don't tell your wife." "No, your majesty." "Don't tell your children." "No, your majesty." "Don't tell your dog." "No, your majesty." And so, every month, Zimmerman came and he cut the king's hair. And he told nobody. He kept the secret. He kept it close to his heart. But the weight The sheer weight of that secret began to weigh down on his shoulders, and he became aged before his time. It was just the most unbearable secret, until one day he could bear it no longer. And he ran to the furthest mountain, climbed to the top, made sure nobody was looking, and he shouted, "The king has a horn! The king has a horn! The king..." Oh, it felt so good! The king has a horn, and there was no one looking, but the sound went down the valley, over the riverbed and into the reeds. And when the wind blew through the reeds, you could hear, "The king has a horn! The king has a horn!" And the children came, and they cut little pipes, and they played their pipes. And when they played their pipes, you could hear a little song. "The king has a horn, the 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 king has a horn." And these children, they went into the town and they played their pipes, and soon everybody was singing "The king has a horn." It became a popular and rather subversive song. "The king has a horn, the king has a horn." And one day in his palace, the king could feel the walls reverberating. And he stepped out onto his balcony, and there they were, in their thousands, all singing, "The king has a horn, the king has a horn, the king has a horn, the king has a horn." "Thug," he shouted, "Thug, chop off their heads, all of them." So out went Thug with his enormous sabre, and was about to begin when the king said, No, stop. If I cut off their heads, what will I be a king of?" And so he retreated into his palace and called his most trusted advisor. "Advisor," he said, I've been doing terrible things." And he took off his crown. "Look," he said, "it's so ugly. It's so horrible. I've filled a whole cemetery full of hairdressers. I mean, what can I do?" And his advisor looked at him, and she said, "Your Majesty, the horn in itself is not ugly. The horn is magnificent. I mean, as far as horns go, there is nothing more magnificent than your horn. What is really ugly is your vanity. Be proud of who you are. Go on, get out there. Show them who you really are." And so the king put back on his crown. He stepped out onto the balcony where the crowd were gathered below. He took a deep breath, and for the first time, he removed his horn. There was a hush, silence. Jaws dropped open, eyes went wide, and then a little voice from the back went, "Oh, it's not that bad." And then someone else went, "Well, there's more room for his brain." So there were some in the crowd who remembered the burden of their own secrets. And there were others who turned to their friends and told them things that they'd been meaning to say for a very, very long time. Now, recently, a coin was found. And by the way, you can post your secrets on chat, really, and, nobody will share them. I mean, you're safe. Recently, a coin was found, and on one side, I can't find it, on one side was a picture of the moon washing in the waters, and on the other was a picture of a king with a magnificent smile and a large horn on his head. Okay, so I'm going to take you somewhere completely different now. Completely different. In sub-Saharan Africa, where the grasslands meet the rainforest, there was a village. And in that village, there was a blind woman who was known for her wisdom. Every day, she would sit at the edge of the village, for she could not work, and she would listen to the sounds of distant animals, the chatter of children in the village, and the sound of the air bending in the heat. She was often the first person that people would see when they came to that village, and they would ask her questions. At first, simple, ordinary questions, but perhaps it was because she was blind and they thought that she would not remember them, or perhaps just because of the quality of her listening. They soon began to ask more personal questions, more delicate, more complex. And the answers she gave were often strange, but when followed, things always turned out for the best. Now, one day she was surprised when her own niece came to see her. "Auntie," she said, "I have a question. I don't know if I should get married or not. I've met a man. He's handsome, he's strong, he has many qualities, but he's also fierce and sometimes arrogant." "Do you love him?" asked the blind woman. "I do," she said. "Well," said the blind woman, "marry him. But you should invite me to come and stay for a while." And so they got married. But the man, who was a hunter, was not so happy. Happy to be married, but not so happy that the blind woman was now part of the family. He said to his wife at night, "Who ever heard of a woman bringing her auntie into the marital home? I mean, she's blind, she's useless, she'll be nothing but a burden to us." "Ah," she said, "but she is wise." Every day the same thing would happen. The hunter would go out into the bush, and just before he left, the blind woman would ask, "Please, can I come with you today?" And he would say, "What, a blind woman hunting? No, ridiculous, no." Again, the same question the next day. "Can I come with you?" No, 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 no. Until one day he'd caught an eland and he had enough food to eat and feed the family for a whole week. And that night, after he had eaten, he was feeling generous. And he said, "Tomorrow I will take you hunting." And so the following morning, they set off together. The blind woman put her arm on his shoulder and they went off into the long grasses. After a moment, she said, "Shh, there's a lion." He pulled out his arrow. "I see no lion," he said. "Don't worry," she said. "It's sleeping." And sure enough, further on, through the grasslands, they came across a lion sleeping. "How did you know?" I can see with my ears," she said. And off they went. Into the forest. "Shh," she said. "There's an elephant." I see no elephant," he said. "Don't worry," she said. "It's washing in a watering hole." And sure enough, a little further through the woods, they came across an elephant. "How did you know?" "I told you. I can see with my ears." Well, the hunter was pleased with the blind woman, so he taught her how to set a trap. And they each laid one trap, and they returned back. And the following morning they set off once more. But this time, she did not put her arm on his shoulder. She led him. She did not trip. She did not fall. She led him all the way to the traps. Now, the hunter opened his own trap, and there was a horrible little grey, scrawny bird. But when he opened her trap, there was a beautiful bird of paradise. "You've caught a bird," he said. And he switched them over, and he gave his scrawny little bird to the blind woman, and he kept the beautiful bird of paradise for himself. "Well done." And they set off. After some time, he said, "Tell me, if you are as wise as my wife seems to think, and you can see with your ears, tell me, why is there so much anger and hatred in the world?" "Because," she said, "the world is full of people like you, who take what is not theirs." The hunter was overcome with shame. "I'm sorry," he said, "I've done you wrong." And he changed over the birds and gave her the beautiful bird that was rightfully hers. And they carried on.